I'm very happy. Okay. Okay, got it. Okay, so today I'd like to introduce a meditation method called Tonglen. But first, let's generate a pure intention for our practice. It's always important to check up, why are we doing what we do? Whether we're reading a book or sitting in meditation or making a meal or whatever we're doing, especially our Dharma practice, it's important to consider, why are we doing this? What is our intention? So we want to set or generate a pure intention for our practice this evening. Um, we begin by thinking, just as I wish to be happy, so do all sentient beings wish to be happy. I think His Holiness Dalai Lama begins every teaching with this reminder. And so in order to generate a pure intention, we could consider the 8 worldly concerns, which we would want to avoid. The 8 worldly concerns, you're probably familiar with them. The concern with pleasure and pain, with loss and gain, with praise and blame, with fame and obscurity. So all of these are a source of suffering and dissatisfaction. So we'd like to avoid all of this. For example, if we're doing a practice thinking, oh, then I will get very skilled and then I can become a teacher. And once I become a teacher, I can make lots of money. And, if this is our motivation, then it's a very contaminated motivation. Or if I teach this practice, then I will get famous and people will admire me. That's also a very contaminated, unworthy motivation. So we want to purify our motivation. And remember, aspire to achieve liberation, or if we wish to become Samyak Sambuddha, we could also generate that intention. Basically, what we want to do is to free our mind so that we can benefit others. So I think this grid of the 8 worldly dharmas provides a very useful sort of yardstick. Why are we doing what we're doing? Are we concerned with, again, pleasure and pain, loss and gain, praise and blame, or fame and obscurity? Right? These are sources of unhappiness for all of us. So we check up, as with all the Buddha's teachings, we check up to see whether this really accords with our own experience. We don't need to accept this grid, but it's a useful guideline for us to check up and to sort of examine the motivation or intention behind our activities, right? So that's by way of introduction. And the practice that I wanted to present this evening is one that you may be well familiar with, the Tonglen. Tong means to send, and len means to take. So basically, sending and taking, right? Or taking and sending, you could say. This is a Tibetan Buddhist practice for awakening compassion by taking on the sufferings of others and sending them happiness. So it's an experience of transforming misfortunes into fortunes. This practice means that we transform the sufferings of sentient beings and send them whatever they want or need. So it sort of reverses the logic that we're familiar with when we think about suffering. Usually suffering is something we want to avoid, right, at all costs. But in this case, we're going to consciously or intentionally take on the sufferings of others and transform them into their opposites. So in this meditation, we give suffering our full attention. And it makes sense too, as the Buddha's first noble truth, as we learned with the young people who spoke the other day on Vesak. It was so informative to see that uh, young people who have already experienced so much suffering and have considered deeply of how to handle suffering. So this is one method for handling suffering. Instead of avoiding it or denying it, we get right into it, right? So when we think of the sentient beings, we do usually visualize human beings, but we don't want to exclude any sentient being. That means we'd like to include animals and the birds and the insects. We'd like to take on their sufferings too. Some people think, oh, I wish I was a bird. I wish I was a horse. I think they haven't thought very carefully about it. The birds, if you watch them, and I do, they're constantly struggling just to get enough to eat. So they look very free and happy, but when you look very carefully, you find that the birds and even the insects are constantly preoccupied with getting enough to eat. Now, we not only do we want to consider all forms of sentient life, all living creatures, but we also want to consider, even among human beings, not only our friends, but also our enemies and also strangers. This meditation was particularly dedicated to those who are suffering from the Ukrainian war, but lest we forget, that's only one of some 50 or 58 conflicts going on in the world today. It's one of the major ones. And the sufferings of war in 2021 were higher than in 2020. And all of this is long before the Ukrainian crisis broke out. So there is plenty enough suffering in the world. We don't have to go far beyond the front page of the New York Times to see that, right? And so rather than pushing it away, we want to acknowledge that suffering and see if we can't do something about it, at least by transforming our own suffering. When we think about the sufferings of others, we often feel very depressed, hopeless, helpless in a way to do something about it. And we can even become a bit morose or depressed about the world situation. But this meditation also helps us by helping us transform negativities. It helps us to cope with all of these sufferings of the world. So we include our friends, our enemies, and strangers, all living beings. And we coordinate our aspirations with our breathing. So when we breathe in, we take on all the sufferings of the sentient beings and we transform them at a small point at our heart. And then we send out all happiness. And we can do this thinking of very specific sufferings and very specific means of happiness or modes of happiness. So we transform all these sufferings out of, instead of holding on to them as we often do, we transform them at our heart and send out the opposites, right? So we're taking on all this negative energy and transforming it into positive energy. So it looks like our time is rather short. So rather than explain all the different sufferings, why don't we meditate? We'll just begin straight into it. And if you would kindly sit comfortably on a cushion or in a chair or in whatever position you feel most comfortable. We first, of course, relax our body and our mind. Can do a quick scan from the top of the head all the way down to our toes to make sure that we're completely relaxed. And then with each in-breath, we take on one particular suffering and transform it into its opposite and send it out to all sentient beings. So we take on the hunger of all sentient beings and we transform that at a point at our heart and send out plenty of good things to eat. We take on the thirst of all sentient beings and transform it into good things to drink, water, and so on. We take on the poverty of all sentient beings and transform it into prosperity. We take on all the illness of sentient beings and send them good health. We take on the oppression of all sentient beings and send them strength. We take on the incarceration of sentient beings and send them freedom. We take on all the conflicts of sentient beings and send them peace. We take on all the anger of sentient beings and send them patience. We take on all the hatred of sentient beings and send them loving kindness. We take on all the fear of sentient beings. Send them courage. We take on all the loneliness of sentient beings. And send them friendship. We take on all the dissatisfaction of sentient beings. So many dissatisfactions. And send them contentment. We take on all the depression of sentient beings and send them lightheartedness. We take on all the miseries of sentient beings and send them joy. We take on all the selfishness of sentient beings, self-centeredness, and send them selflessness. So, in short, we take on all the problems of sentient beings and send them happiness. So, when you're ready, slowly open your eyes. So now there are many different ways to do Tonglen. There are many different varieties. This practice of looking at each of the sufferings individually and sending out their antidotes individually, I find particularly helpful and actually enjoyable. But each person can do it as they wish. You can take on, maybe have some sufferings in mind that I forgot to include. So you could also take on all of those sufferings and then imagine sending out the antidotes or the opposites of those sufferings. I think we have some time for questions and discussion. So if anyone has any questions or ideas, please feel free to chime in. We're just a small group, so you can just feel free to ask your question.
I would like to check out when you say the anecdote of selfishness and self-centeredness is selflessness. I guess I have a question about how to think about self so that you can say, put your mind, get your grasp of what selfishness and self-centeredness is so that you could get to selflessness.
Okay, that's a great question. And it is related in a sense, because, according to the Buddhist teachings, our attachment to self is the root of all our problems. They call it the delusion of the self. We imagine a self that exists very solidly, permanently even, sort of substantially. And it's this self that we seek to protect, so that if someone insults us or falsely accuses us, or we tend to react very strongly based on this delusion of the self. Now, this I recognize is quite countercultural, because the society that we live in is very self-focused. It's become a religion, looking out for number one, and number one is the self. We have in the bookshops, we have whole walls of self-help books, right? And even the books that are being written about success, it's all about me, right? And yet people are not getting happier overall. There's still so many problems, drugs and alcohol and suicide out of control. So I know that many of these books and talks are meant to help to overcome the problems that are afflicting individuals. But the way they're going about it is quite different from the Buddhist way. The Buddha deconstructed the self. He analyzed it into 5 aggregates: the body, the feelings, the recognitions, the karmic formations, and consciousness. And the meditation that we do is to analyze these 5 aggregates, these 5 heaps, to see if we can find a self anywhere among them. But ultimately, we come up empty. So we think about the illness of the self. But then if we analyze what is the self that is ill, we think about the self who lost their job, is so miserable. But where is that self that is so miserable? We think about death. And by clinging to self, often we suffer a great deal thinking about the dissolution of the self. But we're thinking about the dissolution of something that never existed in the beginning. We cannot find those independently existing self. So if we look for an independently existing self, apart from these 5 aggregates, good luck finding anything. So in this deconstruction of the self, we give up our clinging to self. And as we give up our clinging to self, we find that we're no longer disturbed by the emotions that arise when the self is threatened, or feels threatened. So just something to think about, that this is the Buddhist approach. If someone insults us, nobody home. Someone falsely accuses us, nobody to get offended. Of course, on the everyday level, we take care of the self. I mean, we're not refuting the everyday conventional self that exists as a convenient fiction. Mary or Rachel or Lily or Esty. This self, of course, this convenient fiction is very helpful for going about our everyday life. But ultimately, when we try to find an independently existing Mary, and they have many arguments, to help us understand this. So by relaxing our attachment to the self-conceit, I call this conceit of the self. There's such an incredible freedom there. We spend so much energy concretizing it and defending this self, looking out for its, best interests, living its best life. And once we understand the self as simply a convention, we can relax. We have so much more energy for other things. So
I find that as my mother is 107, as I get closer to that, those later heavier numbers,
right,
it does become more, and I think witnessing Thich Nhat Hanh, and then and his passing, then you kind of are, it's definitely a transformation. So, having conversations with people who are still in that process of entering the bardo and going through the different stages of it. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if I should, spend more time with Buddhists who have thought about those issues, as I
Good.
am more aware of them being around my mother or being conscious of my mother going through those stages. So yeah.
Very good.
What is the self?
Very good. Very important. I mean, Lily has just been through the passing of her father at 106. And we were all very aware of this transition, the approach, and then the transition. And all of us, as we get older, need to contemplate this more and more because we're all losing teachers and friends. And so it's very important to make peace with the idea of the dissolution of the self, this conventional self, and then to consider the consciousness that continues, according to the Buddhists, continues to another form, another existence in some form or another. So what we take with us is our karma. We are the owners of our karma, and that continues, but in a different form, right? So good, Mary. It sounds like you're definitely going in the right direction. Wonderful.
I'm certainly glad that there is Buddhism to help us go through, to say nothing like being in Hawaii to deal with this pandemic and the traditions that are very strong here
Yes.
of the Buddhist mind frame.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it manifests in society, caring more about the society than one's own individual comfort, right? Very good. Yes, it has social implications, this concept, definitely. Good. Thank you.
If I may add it to what Mary talking, I think Lekshe, you heard about Dr. Mr. Aoki, right? The professor, and now they have the legacy of his work, and one of his students has been teaching. Unfortunately, next Thursday will be the last class, and it's dealing with this and how prepare and all that, and how we understand ourselves and try to help others to understand. So Mary, if you can go onto the website and look under the legacy of Dr. Matsuo Aoki on death and dying, that is very wonderful. And Lekshe, you did your dissertation on this topic. Maybe you have more to share with us also. As that you said, now we dealing with lots of our friend and family who just leaving us. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yes.
Karma is what we will be with us. Right.
Mhm. It's actually, I worked on this for my dissertation, the topic of dying in Buddhist perspective. Of course, there's not just one perspective. There are many Buddhist schools of philosophy and practice. And so I was working especially with the Tibetan and the Chinese. But of course, in order to do that, we need to look at the foundations, the earliest Buddhist texts as well in the Pali Canon and so on. So it's really quite fascinating. I'd be happy to share it with you, Mary, or anyone who's interested. I'd be happy to share this book with you, actually. And just let me know. But I think that the Buddhist approach is very useful in understanding that the Buddha did not shy away from this topic. And of course, Mitsuoki, who taught death and dying at UH for years, and it was standing room only. Sometimes there would be like 600 students in the class. And he was a Christian minister, but what happened was that he had a near-death experience, as I recall, in Indonesia. And soon after, he met the Dalai Lama, and so he picked up Buddhist ideas as well in his intent to understand better the process of death and dying. So his work is very, very rich and helpful. Yeah, I think we should not shy away from this topic. It's very important, especially now. I mean, in this crazy society. Yeah. So, more ideas, questions? Really?
I think,
Um,
thank,
oh,
oh,
go ahead,
thank
Lily.
you. Okay. Thank you, Lekshe. I particularly like this way of doing Tonglen, as opposed to the tradition. I guess there's a Nyingma traditional way of doing it where, you know, you start with your mother, someone that you love, you know, and then you go further out to people you're indifferent to and even your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it very difficult to do sometimes, that version, but this one feels very intuitive. And it also feels like, because my understanding of Tonlan, because in the beginning I doubted it as a practice, because I said, how could I you know, change the world with just, you know, doing this little exercise in my head. And after doing it for a while, I started to see the value that it's less about whether or not I can send good vibes out into the world and cure all the ills with my good vibes emanating out, but the softening of my own heart and the opening of my heart. I found this practice very helpful in achieving that as the aim. So as you said in the beginning, intentions are really important. But for this particular approach, I like because I could really focus on the specific negative emotions and defilements of the particular situation or the person I'm thinking about, and then thinking of the antidote. So it feels very healing and very effective, you know, to me. So thank you.
I'm very happy to hear. I think that you're right, that this practice has a way of softening our heart and helping us generate boundless compassion, and that it is very healing. Healing in the sense that sometimes we get so frustrated, what can we really do about the sufferings of the world? But in this way, at least in imagination, we're able to transform them. And it does help to heal our own hearts and help us to develop these thoughts of boundless compassion, because sentient beings are numberless. And so when we send out healing thoughts, we're sending them out to an infinite number of beings, which is very powerful. Now, the way that you describe Tonglen practice, I've seen that. But what they've done actually is to combine two different meditations. The first one that you described is actually called Friend, Enemy, Stranger. And usually it's taught as a separate practice, where you visualize friend or relative, enemy right in front of you, and stranger over here. And you practice sending loving kindness equally to all three. But I noticed that in a recent, I think maybe Lions Roar article or a Tricycle article, they combined that with Tonglen. Traditionally, these are two different meditations. So thanks for mentioning that. Both are valuable. And I think the one friend, enemy, stranger is also very valuable, because after all, it's so easy to send loving kindness to those who are lovable. But it's much more difficult to send loving kindness to the nasty sentient beings, the crooks, the the corrupt ones, the mean ones, right? But that's where the practice is really powerful. And then to strangers, look, 7.5 billion people. Normally, we don't even think about all those people, all those, and the fish far outnumber the humans. So we don't even consider the sufferings of all these beings. That's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? We need to expand our awareness. So I think that by learning to generate loving kindness equally for those that we don't get along with, those who abuse us and accuse us, this is really important. Yeah. Good. So,
Yeah.
Esty, did you have a question?
Um,
Observation?
well, I wanted to know again what the name of this professor was at the university. I didn't
yeah.
quite get that.
It's Mits Aoki. Mitsuo
Is
Aoki. Aoki. He did a
A-O-K-I.
he
Yes,
did a video
Mitsuo.
on Death and Dying.
Terrific. Thank you. And I just have a comment. I have used Tonglen also when I'm really miserable and I'm feeling sorry for myself, or I have a pain that I just can't overcome. Like I get migraines, for example, and when they get really bad, there's really hard to get a handle on it. And then I would do Tonglen and I see everybody else having migraines. And I'm taking their headaches and I transform them into clear head. And it truly works. I suddenly don't feel alone anymore. And it really lessens the pain, my own pain. It's a very selfish way to use it. But at the same time, it makes me aware that, all right, this isn't so bad. I mean, there is thousands and thousands or 100,000 people who right now have the same headache like I do. And then it makes it so much less of a cross to bear. So that's kind of, I've used that as like a form of using the Tonglen. Not the only way to use it, of course, but when I find myself in such a situation.
Good. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. That's very moving. And I think that many people have experienced this. That is also one teaching, that when we think about the sufferings of others, it does put our own sufferings in perspective. And sometimes it can actually, help transform them or alleviate them. Because, I mean, all of us have our own stories, our own pains and sufferings. But when we think of the sufferings of others, then sometimes it makes us more philosophical about our own situation, right? Very good. Very good.
Thank you so much, Lekshe. Any other question? It's just about time, 6:25. That we try to keep the program on time. And this is wonderful because it gave us the opportunity to learn about this new way of meditation. I heard about it, but just to learn from you is really great lecture. And and for everyone, I have the name of Dr. Mitsuo Oki on the chat, and as well as the HEB website that you want to check any program that we recorded, and then also the future program information would be in there. And also because another suffering for the Ukraine is financial, to help with that humanitarian. So as a Buddhist, we practice dana. So I have it on the web as well, how you can help them through the website. And actually, is gone through the Maitreya Institute here in Hawaii. So with this couple that were here with us last month, give us the report how they fundraise and help people in Ukraine. And next month, we have it again on the 4th Sunday. And the couple would like to come back and give a update to us. And so please, I think when you sign up for this one, our webmaster has set up the way that you will get the invitation sent to you with this. And anyway, yeah, please look at our website, and then if you want to understand more and hear more what Lekshe taught us, we will have recording probably in about a week or two. I'll post it up there. And thank you so much, Lekshe, for all this valuable teaching. And usually for HEP, we end our program with Metta Sutta, in a way that compassion also. And today we are very fortunate to have Mrs. Glenda Page, the widow of Dr. Glenn Page. Dr. Glenn Page, many of you know, he's the U.S. professor in political science, founder of the Center for Global Non-Killing. And what is important about him connect to HEP, he was with us in 1992, helping with on the board. And also he helped the Muriangsa, the Korean temple in Palolo, to be able to build on that land. They have many legal issues. And we remember that HEP board meeting used to go there when it just started. And so Dr. Glenn is very important also for HEP and for Muriangsa especially. And actually his ashes is kept there at Muriangsa because he's just like the founder of Muriangsa to get that temple going. And so we have his widow, Mrs. Glenda Page. I'm going to put up the screen share, and to everyone can just mute yourself, and Glenda unmute and read it for us, and we can follow along, because if everyone unmute, the sound is kind of feedback. Just one moment, I will put this up. Okay. Glenda.
Thank you, Purni. May all beings be happy. May they be joyous and live in safety. All living beings, whether weak or strong, in high or middle or low realms of existence, small or great, visible or invisible, near or far, born or to be born, may all beings be happy. Let none deceive another, nor despise any being in any state. Let none by anger or hatred wish harm to another. Even as a mother at the risk of her life watches over and protects her only child, so with a boundless mind should one cherish all living things, suffusing love over the entire world, above, below, and all around, without limit. So let each cultivate an infinite goodwill toward the whole world.
Thank you everyone very much for joining us. And we see you next month, June 26th. And next month is a turn of male teacher. We take the female and male. And so different tradition. So now we learn about Tonglen. And next month we will learn from the Palolo teacher, Michael Kiran, also the president of HEP. So he will be lead us into Zen practice. So we learn, because HEP is just unity and diversity. So we learn different way of doing meditation. Yeah, the purpose is just what? To clear our mind and to have compassion, send it out. Okay, thank you so much and have a good evening. Goodbye, everyone. Bye-bye.